morning, everyone.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
Good morning. This morning, we are really, really excited. We have with us Dr. Sarah Pizano. Dr. Pizano, she is with Team Shelter USA. And we have Steve. Steve, how do you pronounce your last name?
It's
Calco.
Calco.
Calco. And he's with the Great Pyrenees Rescue of Missouri. And this morning, we are talking about all dogs in shelters, rescues, and boarding. Our dogs in shelters, rescues, and boarding facilities living in heaven or hell. I'd like to have Dr. Pisano explain a little bit about what she does before we get into the actual show, because in her case, she is really involved with shelters on this subject. So if you wouldn't mind, Doctor, please explain a little bit about what you do, and then we'll go into the show.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Kathy, and welcome everyone. So, Team Shelter USA does holistic shelter and community assessments. And by that, I mean, I look at everything from the state laws, local ordinances, intake policies, field services, and how all of that affects shelter intake. What are the intake policies, population management within the shelter? Are the animals in a fear-free environment? And do they have a short length of stay? Are they comfortable while they're in the shelter? And I benchmark all of those things against best practices and help those shelters improve in whatever areas they want to improve. And I've done well over 100 assessments, 22 states, all over the country. And all of that knowledge was quite humbling for me to realize that we all share the same challenges, maybe to different varying degrees, no matter where we live, rural, urban, north, south, east, west. And guess what? We all have it's all the same solutions. So I actually published the best practice playbook for animal shelters to talk about all those different strategies. But it's been really eye-opening for me. And when I just looked back at about 18 of those shelters in the very first year with me, there were almost 50,000 less euthanasias. And then a lot of other things improved as well. But that's a little bit about Team Shelter and what I do.
Okay, thank you. And Roman is the one that came up with the topic for today's show. So what is it that we want to have the viewers learn by the end of the show today, Roman?
By the end, I would like a person who wants to board his dog, a person who wants to adopt a dog, a person who wants to have his dog being taken care of, a rescue who wants a dog being care of, um, a town that wants the dogs to be taken care of. Understand the risk of having a dog in a shelter, the risk management, the crisis management. What happens if something goes wrong? Do I have enough people to help those dogs? We see all these floodings and fires. We didn't have enough people to help those dogs. We didn't have enough vehicles to move those dogs away from the crisis in a short period of time. There was nothing in place. And I think that's a wake up call. It's nothing different if we have children in a hospital and we don't have enough personnel to get the children out of the hospital in a safe manner. Just because they're different species doesn't make it less of an urgency to take care of that for especially animals who cannot open the door themselves. They cannot scream and yell for help. They cannot call somebody to support them. They just there waiting for to be supported. And it's not going to happen until we step in and says we need to guide with our power as an end user to force the situation to make a decision towards that safety.
Okay, sounds good. And Gaytan, everyone, for those that don't know, Gaytan is a partner, is my partner in Picture Moment Pet Productions. He's a wonderful producer and a wonderful director. You have your mute on.
Yes, I want to let you talk.
Oh, okay. And just wanted to let you know that what he does is he looks and he now starts to put things together because we're building a series. And I think Dr. Pisano, you know that we're doing shelters across America, and Dr. Pisano will be the host of the new series coming up. We planned on doing it a little bit earlier, but not now. So, Gaytan, thanks for being here, and
You're welcome.
let's get into the actual show now. Here's the first subject: the regulation of shelters, rescues, and boarding facilities. And I know that Steve, you have something that you want to talk about on this, so go ahead.
Well, rescues. That's what I know. I've been rescued for a long time. Um, and obviously, rescues are different, even from rescues. Our rescue were breed specific with a guardian breed, the Great Pyrenees. And that breed's not for everybody. Now, with the other rescue I was with, we actually had a shelter facility, a kennel for boarding. They could house, just on our little side, up to 12 dogs. That's a lot of giant breed dogs in one little building. So, um, and the safety, all right. Whenever you work with animals, the dogs, especially the guardian breed, you're at a higher risk of getting bit than most people. So, safety. How do we keep from getting bit? Because we don't know these dogs, so we know how to approach. Now, one of the things that we had done, the building was long and skinny, all right, 47 feet long, 16 feet wide. And um, what do we do if there's a fire? There's no sprinklers. Fire extinguisher isn't going to put out fire at the building made of wood that was built in 1967. Um, so what do? Well, we get the heck out. We come up with a plan to get the dogs safe, but yet contained, and get them out. And I think that's very important. Now, with what Roman had going on out in the West, my plan wasn't going to do anything for that. All right, because we're talking multi-state fires is what they had, and uh, that's a whole different ballgame there. But training, and and people, just like Roman says, you have to have enough people. So, and you don't, and it takes more people than just handling the dogs at hand. Okay, just like Gaytan. All right, it takes people to put this show together. Okay? We um,
That's
we
right.
we do a show on Saturdays. All right, I know it takes a little bit to put it together, and um, it takes people, educated people, and they don't have to be book smart. They have to be educated with the task that you need to handle. Okay. Um, Rescues are regulated by the Department of Agriculture. All right.
Did
We've
you want me
never.
to show your
Well, yeah, you can if you want. You got to
okay.
register once a year. This is what the other rescue had for the state of Ohio. You have to register in each individual state. All right. The rescue I'm with now, Great Pyrenees Rescue in Missouri, they have to do the same thing. If they have fosters or doing business in the state, that's who they have to register with. So now in the state of Ohio, if you do any kind of fundraising, you also have to register with the Attorney General. Right? So that's just for fundraising, though. So, and rescues survive on fundraising. All right, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, you see posted all the time these dogs that come in and they're in poor shape, and you'll see somebody put down there, oh, all that dog needs is a little bit of love. Yeah, trust me, the rescue's got all the love. It also takes funds. So, and so sprinkler systems in kennel facilities in the state of Ohio, they don't have any regulation like that. At least they didn't for our facility. All right. Maybe it was because of square footage. I'm not sure. But yeah, boy, they wanted those fire extinguishers up, right?
Yeah.
As if
Right.
it was going to put out a fire. But so safety is very, very important because you've got not only the safety of the dogs, which is number one, that's why we're there, and are they in heaven or hell? And that depends on how you look at it.
Right.
And
Right.
that depends on how you look at the dog's needs. All right. So we get a lot of people saying, "Oh my God, that dog's been in that kennel for 2 months, and oh my God, he's not surviving, and this is happening." Here's something that you got to take into consideration. That dog could have been a stray all of his life, scrounging for food, sleeping under a car to stay dry, and now he's in a heated, climate controlled, air conditioned kennel, and he is living the good life in his mind because he doesn't know there's anything else.
Exactly.
The
Exactly.
human is the one that has the issue with that. Now, do we want a dog living in a kennel for 2 months? Personally, I want the right home for the dog.
Exactly.
All right, because one of the things rescue has a problem with, and by the way, our rescue here, we don't have the same problem, but it happens, but returns. Okay, because you can have a dog that sleeps with the cats in the foster home. The adopter gets them, and they got a cat, and the dog eats the cat.
Yeah,
Wait a
right.
minute, I thought he was going to get along with cats. No, he got along with those cats
Yeah,
in
that's the
that
profiling.
environment. Okay, so, but we know he's capable of doing it, so we have to make it happen. But anyway, we're not doing a training session. So
Okay. Okay.
anyway,
All right.
um,
Thank
they're
you.
not in hell in the facilities that I know of.
Okay. Now, Dr. Pisano and Roman, the personnel education at those facilities of handling emergency evacuations, what's your comment on how you feel that's being handled? Let's start with you first, doctor.
Well, if I could just back up so the audience understands, like, sort of the infrastructure around animal sheltering in the United States, every state law speaks to animal cruelty, and then there's some variation in whatever else they might address. But the states give the municipalities, which could be the counties or the towns and cities, the authority to write their own ordinances and create the animal control program. And that means between county to county, and even sometimes within cities within the same counties, there's an absolute, well, there is no uniformity. And people often ask me, like, well, how does it work? I'm like, it's not a one, it's not the same in every single community. And there's different types of shelters. So there are three main categories. One is a public municipal shelter, one is a nonprofit private shelter, and then the third kind is a combination of the two, which means the municipality operates the shelter and the nonprofit helps, or the nonprofit operates the shelter and the municipality has a contract with that shelter. And so when you're talking about operations or emergency and evacuations, there is no norm, and it depends on who is overseeing the shelter and how they have decided to set up an emergency plan, or perhaps have not set up an emergency plan. So there really isn't one answer to all of that. I think we saw great progress after Katrina because of the horrific tragedy and disasters that we saw unfold, not just for animals, but people too. But a lot of things improved after that. And I think my biggest advice to groups is partnership and build relationships so that if you are ever experiencing an emergency, you have people to turn to that can and you can help them when they need it, and they can help you when you need it.
Okay, thank you very much. Roman, now, what services do these facilities provide?
Well, first of all, we have the services of care for the dog. So people drop off the dogs in the morning and they pick them at some point throughout the day. The regulation says that the dog should be cared at least once in a 24-hour. So once the dog is in, he's being taken care of. Theoretically speaking, legally speaking, he's fine for the next 24 hours until somebody picks the dog up. However, some boarding facilities are a little bit more advanced. They have different programs. How many times do you want me to take your dog out? How many times do you want to play date? So you just add to your regular plan, dropping off the dog and picking up the dog, individual services into that, which means eventually just playing one on one in a group, having the pool available, having a TV on, having a radio on, having a soft bedding in there. All these things coming up is just to make people feel good. Now, how does this apply to the dog? There's no regulations in US that says how big the kennel has to be in a shelter. and where these people will put finally the dog in there. So if there are bigger kennels, smaller kennels, it's the person's decision what kind of size kennel he wants. And usually there should be only one dog per kennel. Now people can also put two dogs per kennel because they say they're family, they can stay together. So we're gonna put more dogs per kennel because they're family. And so these are also changes. The other one that's going to happen is how many times the dog is being fed overnight. And then it's up to the personnel itself to check in and see how many times the water needs to be checked, um, how many times the dog has to be taken out. There is really no regulation on that part. It's up to the facility. Um, Now, I did some evaluation on a couple of kennels that I work with, doing holistic approach in animal care, not the whole system as Sarah does. And I see that people actually don't have an idea about what the dog's needs are at the base. They don't understand if a dog is anxious, he's going to need more water. If the dog has um, spilled out his water, he needs fresh water. If the dog went out to the bathroom and he didn't poop, it's because not because he didn't like to poop. Maybe he was too stressed to poop. So he needs still to go to the bathroom, and that time frame is not good enough. So there is no adjustment to the dog. It's just down the protocol. One person or two people have to go through the individual kennels taking the dog out no matter what. So if a dog needs more time, it's not being taken in consideration. So these are a few things that people don't know, and some businesses don't let even people go backstage. Um,
Right.
the circulation of air circulation is not enough. It's not clean. It's dirty. It's not cleaned out with proper chemicals. So dogs get allergies and inflammations on the legs, and get injuries, and it's nobody looking at it so far. The other thing that I see is that if you don't provide your own food, they will give their food, and there is no regulations what food they should give as cheap as possible, right? No,
Or
and how old is
donated, or
or
donated.
donated food. Now that doesn't apply to the shelters. Shelters are a little
Right.
bit different because sometimes they are privately organized shelters, and sometimes they are based on the town, and they're under the supervision of the town officials. And then there are other ones who are mixed. So there is the town involved, but there are volunteers working on it. It's a combination of things. It gets really more complicated. And then there is the funding on how much money get these shelters available to work with those dogs. So I remember a colleague did a study back then. It was in 2011 that a dog in a shelter will cost about $75 per day for the first 13 days of stay, which includes animal care, veterinary care, and everything included. Now, the interesting part is that after that, there is no study how much will continue the dog cost while he stays there. And we don't really have a number on private businesses. Usually it's charged about 35, $25, $35. I was charging $75 because I had training included. So the price range varies depending on what your service you're adding to that. But still, it doesn't secure the safety and quality handling of the dog. Once the door is closed, once the dog is in, it becomes kind of a black box. Nobody really knows what's happening there unless you have a video surveillance camera that you literally watch what's happening and only what the camera catches. Now, the reason why I asked our show today to kind of look in that direction is because very often lately major disasters are happening, not only about nature, but people's neglect. So lately, 75 dogs died in a fire, and nobody was there to call the fire department.
Yeah. Right.
How
Yeah.
is this possible?
Right.
If
I
I
have
could,
a. Go ahead. Go ahead, Sarah.
sorry, if I could jump in, I want to make sure that everybody knows that there are recommendations for housing requirements for dogs and cats in confinement. Unfortunately, they can't be regulated, but for the most part, but the Association of Shelter Veterinarians guidelines for standards of care, and I can put the website in the chat. They can be found at sheltervet.org, and there are very well established guidelines, especially and square footage for cats. And also the USDA does have recommendations regarding the square footage needed for dogs in confinement. But the unfortunate part is that when you talk about regulation, there is no at the national level or at the state level, besides some states having that Department of Agriculture coverage. But I have not yet seen a Department of Agricultural requirements that were in line with the Association of Shelter Veterinarian guidelines. For example, in one state that I was doing an assessment in a municipal shelter there, the director said, well, we clean once a week as per the Department of Agricultural guidelines. And in a shelter, dogs' runs need to be sanitized every day and obviously spot
Yeah.
cleaned every day if they're
Wow.
not going out. So
Once a
so there
week. Oy, oy, oy.
yeah,
Yeah.
but there are recommendations. The problem, as Rowan said, is that there is not a regulatory body that's uniform that I can call and say there are violations here and there needs to be attention given. There's no accountability, unfortunately.
I came across a case where the cage were stacked in top of each other in the current. Is that
Yeah,
normal, or is that an exception,
yeah.
or is that like a mismanagement, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, there is, I don't know what happened in the 1960s, but there were a heck of a lot of shelters built, and they were built for dogs, not for cats. And I understand this is a dog show, but if you care about dogs and dogs going to shelters, you better
Mhm.
fight to keep community cats the heck out of shelters because they're clogging the shelters. Therefore, we don't have the resources that we need for dogs. And with great respect, I say that I have spent my career in sheltering with the sole purpose and goal of keeping animals out of a shelter. All of us who work in shelters care very deeply, but it's not the best option. And some people might say, well, that wasn't the home that they should be in. Maybe that's true, but there are foster homes. We want to transition to a more community based. But when you talk about housing, there are a lot of those older shelters, and unfortunately, I've seen newer shelters that don't have appropriate housing. So those recommendations that I spoke about that are too small, and having cages stacked on top of one another is not appropriate. Animals need appropriate space, no different than people. So when we walk into shelters where the animals can't lay down without touching something, stand up normally, and some people in this group are, I think in my age group, you know what a telephone booth is. Some of the younger ones might not know that, but I say, like, it's like living in a telephone booth with your toilet and your kitchen and everything is in the telephone booth. And
Hmm.
so unfortunately, and my work since 2013 has greatly skewed towards shelters that are euthanizing for space. And so I can tell you that humane housing is a serious issue, and it's in 2021. This should not be an issue. We have the studies, we have the research, we know what animals need in confinement, and if we exhaust every option to keep them out of the shelter, once they come to the shelter, we have to make sure we have a plan to get them out as soon as possible. And if you're not familiar with fear-free sheltering, that's fearfreesheltering.com. It's another great training to open people's eyes about what animals are perceiving, because in the best of the best shelters, it's not a home.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll put that information in the chat.
Okay, and I'll share it. So, Steve, what's your comment on what Dr. Pisano just said?
Um, we need a lot of improvements in the area of sheltering, and um, definitely cleanliness. She hits a nail right on the head. Roman, I made a comment one time that he ran with. Somebody had mentioned how clean our runs were on. All they saw was the outdoor runs, and that's another thing they're building today, because municipalities are having codes against indoor outdoor runs at the shelters because of the noise. So the dogs are cooped up inside, and I think they should have their outdoor time too. But anyway, that's another story. But Cleanliness, paid boarding. Everyone I've ever seen, when a dog leaves, they get disinfected. Everything cleaned up, disinfected, and so the next dog can come in. In our facility, um, the dogs were there not just overnight or a few days. Our dogs actually lived there for whatever period of time until we were able to get them into foster. But so no, we didn't disinfect the indoor every day. We did the outdoors very often because if they used the bathroom, you just became unsanitary. And
How many animals are housed in these facilities?
So,
um,
oh,
go ahead.
Go.
so that the answer is called capacity for care. And that
Okay.
means I have appropriate space for the size of the animal. So a Pyrenees, right? And I've seen large dogs housed in stainless steel cages where they can't stand up. That's not appropriate housing. So capacity for care means I have enough appropriate space per animal, but I also have the staff and volunteers to care for them appropriately, to give them the appropriate attention, feeding twice a day, enrichment, play groups for dogs, all of those things. And I have the resources. So if animals come in and they are sick or injured, they have access to the veterinary care they need. So the answer varies um, shelter to shelter and depends on what is available for them. But again, to me, it's all about number one, partnerships. The bigger your volunteer program is, the better the shelter pets will be treated. But most importantly, every single shelter, public, private, or that combination I was talking about, needs to focus very seriously on safety net and intervention so that we exhaust all opportunities and alternatives as opposed to taking animals in the shelter. We weren't doing that 15 years ago, 20 years ago when I was public shelter director. Now we find people are hungry for assistance. They just didn't have that opportunity. And we have lots of great studies now, the ASPCA and others have done, that showed, there was one study in LA, the 80% of the people that were surrendering did not want to surrender. They just needed that access. And so imagine when you decrease that, the number of animals going into the shelter, when you talk about how many can you house, we shouldn't be talking about how many can house. We should be talking about how can we help people keep or place their pets directly. And there is our information about shelter capacity and the capacity for care.
Okay, I have another question now, doctor. Let me stop this screen here. I have another question. Let me pull this up here. Speaking of that, emergency care regulations, I'd like to talk on that just for a second here. In this area, we had a dog that stayed in the shelter. It was a puppy, and the puppy had a dislocated femur. And by the time they somebody came to foster it, it was 5 days, and the puppy never had any medication, so it screamed for 5 days. The shelter said, well, we can't do it because it's not according to our regulations. Well, looking into it, that wasn't true. So I'm sure that there's always a fine line. Who makes these regulations? Where do they
There's
come from?
there's not a fine line. When an animal enters a shelter and they need XYZ, if it's an emergency and the shelter, there are no other options for that pet, that no, then perhaps if it's in a critical animal, then they may need to be euthanized, but they need to see a veterinarian that day. So when you ask about where the regulations are, like I described, there's no regulatory agency, but the state statute speaks to cruelty and what that means.
Hmm.
And so it is, and I'm not sure. I can't speak to their response because I don't know them directly. But again, if you take an animal into your shelter, you are responsible to provide it with basic care. And with a case like that, that would have been a puppy. It sounds like they don't have a veterinarian on staff. Day one, that puppy needed to see a veterinarian and be put on the appropriate pain medication. and
Okay.
and a treatment plan created.
Okay, Roman, you just brought this up. I like this here: freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from
Yeah,
pain,
five
injury,
freedoms.
or
It's the
disease, freedom
basics.
from fear, and distress, freedom to express normal behavior.
Let's
Yes,
look into that a little bit because freedom of hunger. If a shelter only is reliant on donations of people, they will not be able to feed appropriately and appropriately for those dogs. Not every dog can have that whatever food comes in, no matter the condition of that food. Some of them are even bad food that's being dumped from a truck and fell down and the back was open, and it's not healthy to approach. And then we have freedom of thirst, the easy things, right? So if I don't have fresh water in that kennel and only fill it up on top of the previous water, there is salvia. This water is contaminated. Dogs don't drink contaminated water from nature. They want fresh water. And so we see also freedom of pain. What is pain? Just the physical pain? Dogs don't show pain and it's really hurting. Or what's about the emotional pain? How do we define that? Injury or disease. So we need to make sure that we understand and we have an education of people to recognize a pain of a dog. A dog who is in a corner and is shaking, just because he doesn't cry doesn't mean he's not in pain, right? And then fear, distress, and fear of express normal behaviors. What is a normal behavior? Normal behavior is being able to move. So if a
right,
dog doesn't have room to move because in that confined place, most of that it takes over the bed and his food bowl and his dirt, then he has only about 15 square inch to move, which is not appropriate for the dog to move,
right.
right? We have high kennels, but we don't have wide kennels just because,
Yeah,
okay? And then we have all these huge properties for public golf courses, and we have this little property for animal care. That's disproportional, right?
yeah. So, Steve, you had something that you wanted to say?
About the care and the shelters themselves, you discussed the dog, the puppy with the broken leg. When rescued, especially this time, this day and age, because rescues shelters are just flooded, okay, overloaded, and rescues will pull the injured dogs first, okay, because they know they're not going to get the care necessary in a shelter. Now, majority of the dogs that over the years I've been in rescue don't have a rabies vaccination because they would have to pay a vet to do that. They can give the others because you can buy them over the counter, most of them, but or they can get them. But rabies vaccine has to be administered by a vet because it's a law. You have to have a rabies vaccine in your dog, and um, so that means a vet has to do it. And shelters typically don't do that unless they have a vet on staff.
Okay. Uh,
And that's just a small example.
thanks. Roman, let's go on to this now about what agency is responding to oversee the welfare of these animals.
I have to find that agency. I haven't
Okay.
seen an agency that actually
Yeah,
follow through with things.
None.
And
Dr.
yeah,
Pizano, any?
no.
Okay.
There's no uniform singular place. Um, ASPCA and HSUS have occasionally done cruelty investigations, but it's not that common. And there is a desperate need, in my opinion, for regulation, inspection of the basics, et cetera, so that animals get the care they need. There's accountability for shelters.
well, the fun fact, which is sad fact, is that in some areas, I'm not going into states and towns in particular, but there are many areas that I know in person where the animal control officer is closely related with the owner of the facility who breeds dogs. So if something comes up, the first one to be called is, "Hey, Frank, these people are coming over for a checkup. Make sure you have to, taking care of business, right?" And then if there is something that's happening and people call the animal control because they see those problems coming up, then they just don't show up. Or you being actually harassed or actually being shut down if you kind of complain about it. So it's kind of like a little family business going on there. And we need to make sure we cannot push that responsibility to somebody who's in the community. It has to be somebody who's outside of the community. But on the other hand, we have another issue that those big organizations like um, um, Department of Agriculture, it's not just the dogs they have to take care of. They have to take care of all this stuff. It's kind of like you have to have every 15 agents in each town taking care of different stuff on meat production, animal care, veterinary care, properties, and all this stuff has to be regulated. There is not enough personnel there. So, but there's always the end user who is on that button he can push. If I am
Exactly.
aware where to go, if I'm aware how to get, and if I'm aware who to call and push the buttons, then how about 15 people call one particular person in a specific chair, and then he has to make it happen. Because why? Because he would not be elected,
Hmm.
right? And then, of course, there is money behind that because we know that animal business is big business. There are billions of dollars coming in, and it's a self-feeding process in that. Sick dogs make more money, keep the dogs sick, the more dogs being adopted and more dogs being circulated. Only 20% of those dogs that we see and say, oh my God, shelters are full. Only 20% are those dogs that we see officially. The rest goes under the radar. Frank
Hmm.
gives to Susie and Susie gives to Frank, and Frank, has a truck, and truck goes to the parking lot and then Home Depot and all these places. And all of a sudden we see that we're really looking at those little tiny dots, and we say, oh my God, such a disaster, and we don't see the big picture here. So if I have regulations how a breeding facility can allow a dog to be on a wire kennel bottom, if they allow that, then I don't need to look any further because that dog is in pain just standing in the kennel that you approve to be appropriate.
Dr. Pisano, you wanted to make a comment on what Roman just said?
Right. So I'm not sure what you meant, Roman, by the 20% of the dogs we're seeing. Are you talking about breeding
No, the dogs who
facilities
end up
or
in a shelter,
okay.
the 20% of all the dogs out there that being rehomed, changing hands, go through a shelter, just 20%. So
Oh,
if
I
we
see what
say
you're saying. Yes.
shelters are full of dogs, then only
Right. Yes.
20% of dogs who are
Right.
somewhere to need to be go somewhere else.
Yes.
Well, I wanted to add to that. When I ran a shelter in the 70s, so that's like 50 some years ago. And yeah, I know. And it
You
was
mean last week?
yeah, right. You might even remember them. Save a Pet
Right.
in Illinois. Okay, I ran that, and we had 250 dogs. We were filled to capacity all the time, but things seem to be so much simpler than they do now. I'm not really sure where the breakdown comes in. I don't know whether it's on the management side or there's just too many dogs. Money, just too many
Well,
dogs.
no, actually, in the 70s, over 20 million animals went into animal shelters. And last year, we're down somewhere around 5 million. And if you want to, I can put this in the chat, or Kathy, please do. Bestfriends.org has
Okay, let me put
collected
that.
bestfriends.org has collected the most accurate database because they've gone municipality to county by county in the entire United States. So it's not perfect, but it represents over 95% of animals in shelters. And we are down to about 5 million animals in shelters a year, which is amazing from where we were in the 70s. I want to say last year there were 347,000 euthanasias nationwide. Again, down from many, many millions in the 70s and 80s. So there is great progress. And why we're seeing overcrowding, at least today and now, even post the onset of COVID, is because shelters don't want to euthanize for space, but there's a longer length of stay, and therefore you may get overcrowding. And there's a lot of struggle right now with that issue, especially as what's called destination shelters, who normally take animals from the southern states in particular, where the shelters are mostly overcrowded. We're doing amazing in the Northwest and Northeast and middle of the United States, but the southern states are still struggling. So we are seeing a lot of overcrowding, and it's more so length of stay versus the number of animals going into shelters. But in my opinion, it's still too many. Again, we have to focus on getting our Good Samaritans and advocates and communities involved in so that they don't end up in the shelter.
Okay, so the goal is really that we don't want to see them go into that's the last place to go to.
Right.
And where Roman is coming from is he's saying, but the boarding facilities and the rescues and that, maybe they're not all working cohesively together, because I know in some states it's like clockwork. They work together hand in hand. And then in other states, they fight with each other. With the onset of social media, sometimes that's a real curse and sometimes it's a real blessing. But if they find, let's say, a rescue does something wrong, then they pounce on them immediately, and that ruins the relationship with them in that particular area. It's just my opinion. So, what do you
Well,
think?
Well,
I've,
one
I've worked in hundreds of communities, and I have to say that there are some where everyone is working really well together for the most part. But 100% of the communities that I visited have lots of drama and bad blood between groups. So I've never walked into a community where it was a group hug. So I think every type of every type of organization, whether it's a public or private shelter or hybrid or volunteers or rescue groups, all of us need to focus on the goal of helping animals as opposed to judging and fighting with each other. We spend
Yeah,
way too much time fighting that we could use productively to help animals. So there has not, I'll go to community and a mayor will say, "Oh, you don't understand, Dr. Pizano. The groups don't get along here." I'm like, anywhere USA, I could be anywhere. Doesn't matter. I mean, so
yeah,
it's unfortunately it's the norm, unfortunately, and I'm heartbroken to say that. But I hope all of us can continue to be the doves and the networkers and the connectors and the people who bring people together to make it better for animals that need help, people who need help. Maybe they just need temporary assistance or a fence fixed or
hmm,
something to keep their pets and keep their dogs safe, and all work together, because boy, if we harness that energy that's wasted fighting, the world would be perfect in animal
yes,
welfare.
right, yeah. And
I
Steve,
I,
think one
Yeah. Um,
Steve, I knew you wanted to comment on that because I could see your head
been
going.
in, been in rescue a long time, and Roman actually came up with a word for this: volunteer fatigue.
That's true.
Okay,
Yeah. Battle fatigue.
and
Yeah.
yeah, but this is volunteer fatigue, and you know, one thing I will say for rescues, even the ones that don't get along, a lot of rescues don't get along amongst each other in their own group sometimes. Okay, there's where the volunteer fatigue could be coming into play. We're not medical doctors here. We're behaviorists, all right? So maybe we're qualified to call that one. But when it comes to a dog, a certain dog in need, they still come together, all right? And they still go take care of that dog because it still takes a village.
Right.
And some villages are larger than others and some aren't. But what I think is, I think something that would really help these animals. She compared the '70s to now, from X number of million down to 5 million, and that's a good number. Okay, but I think educating when I was young, and we got a dog, the words "get rid of that dog" wasn't even in our vocabulary back then. You got the dog, you kept the dog no matter what. You cared for
Hmm.
your commitment, just like a child. And somewhere along the line, we seem to, as a society, we seem to be losing that. And
Right.
they're disposable now. And the Great Pyrenees, there's well, two of them in Cubas, but there's three Great Pyrenees here for all practical purposes. They have very fragile personalities. They're a bad guardian breed. Don't get me wrong, but they're still just as fragile of a personality as any other. So society is changing.
Yeah, well, we've been talking about what really needs improvement, and let's kind of close the show with
Yeah.
what needs improvement. What do you think needs improvement, Steve?
Education,
Okay.
education. And
And
Roman's
Roman,
doing sign language, and
yeah,
I
Roman,
need to be
Roman,
educated.
what are you saying?
So I give a number. 85 million people own a pet, which is 67% of the population in US. That's statistic recently. Now imagine all those 85 million people know how to care for their dogs.
Yeah,
Guess what's going to happen? Suddenly, we will not have so many people need to get a pet, and there is no recycling of pets. Oh, I don't like that. I get another one. There is more responsibility. There is healthier choices, and that will drive the industry, no matter where the industry is coming from, food, nutrition, care, in a direction that is healthier. And we have to start educating the children what proper animal care is, because here are the facts. My personal facts, but also statistic from Europe. A child can affect his mother, his father, and his grandparents. One child can affect four people at least. So if we educate the child, that child has effect on his family, and that family naturally will do what the child says, because you cannot say no to a child, right? So this is how the milk industry got the milk package into school, by convincing the children you have to have that Tetra Pak milk in your refrigerator, and then everybody had to buy it. So if the children has such a dynamic, we can educate the children how to care for their dogs, which reduces the reason why dogs being surrendered to the shelters because of bite injuries. And still 450,000 children beaten by dogs every year. And then we have 3.2 million people get hurt every year by usually their own dogs or the family dogs. And all of a sudden, having that education in place, those numbers go down. And then we have people understanding, well, I will not be able to get a dog from a breeding facility because it's unhealthy for the dog. Because even if the rescue tells me I cannot adopt a dog, I still have to wait because maybe I'm not ready to get a dog yet. So the industry has to kind of understand to heal itself as a system. So we become more aware where to get our information from, and not just go out there because the shelter said no, because the rescue said no. I'm going to the breeder up there in Ohio and get a dog out of the online. I'm not made me clear. There are healthy breeders who breed for the breed trades, breeders who breed for the money, and then we have the other breeders who are just opportunists and asset management systems, whatever they do. We need to raise awareness on that. So while we're trying to rescue and save the ship from sinking, we need to stop the water coming in, and the water comes in from
yeah,
lack of education. We have to
Kathy, can
understand
I
how.
add something to that? Because I do come from a slightly different perspective, and I do a lot of work around access to care. There are tens of millions of people on government assistance. There are tens of millions of people not on government assistance, all who have pets in their home and are one paycheck away from not being able to pay their bills. And so access to care is actually, to me, the bigger issue, because we know when we have subsidized care, whether it's for spay neuter or veterinary care, those programs flourish. They get support from the community, and there's a great, we are working on, we have a new nonprofit around this called Open Door Veterinary Collective. But access to care is the bigger issue, because you can educate somebody who's below the poverty level all you want and say they shouldn't have pets, but yet there are tens of millions of pet owners below the poverty level. So access to care, in my opinion, is the most important.
That's a good point too, because you can't regulate that out either. Okay.
It's a triangle: access to
Yeah.
care,
Yeah,
Yeah.
education.
yeah.
And
yeah,
also, Roman did a video here a few years ago that very good one, and he said, "You want a rescue dog? What are you doing for the next 10 years?" It's that type of education also. Okay, to go with. We seem to be some areas. I'm not going to say it's everybody. I'm not going to put it all across the board. Compassion seems to be
and
being put on the
empathy.
back burner.
Yeah. Yeah. Roman, you were finishing what you were saying about the oh gosh, just totally went blank.
So one thing I
Okay.
want to point out is we have to be aware where we distribute our donations. So we have local shelters and local communities. They are handy. You can reach out. You can talk to physical people. You can go visit. You can go volunteer. And then you have these out of state rescues and out of state whatever 501c3s that want your money. So think wisely. Where would you invest? Somewhere you don't know, somebody who tells you they do all these fancy things, or somebody you see they do fancy things? And this may gives you the power to also support your local community who will at some point save your dog who got out of the shelter or out of your yard, end up in a shelter, and then you have to complain why the dog is being put to sleep because he was first in, first out situation and nobody showed up there because there was no system to let you know
Right.
that your dog is in there and you had no clue who to reach out. So all these systems kind of come together. Stay local with your support, stay local with your fines and the support local rescues that you know and understand. Having a 501c3 doesn't guarantee you quality of service.
Right. Right. And doctor, last thoughts for you.
I sound like a broken record, but I'll never stop preaching to, do whatever you can to keep animals out of shelters in loving homes, whether it's even just fostering till you find them a home. And if they do end up in the shelter, support your shelter so that they can do better and get animals out of the shelter as soon as possible. And I always think about your own pet. How long would you want your own pet in the shelter? For me, it's 0 minutes. So
Yes.
if I feel that way for my pets, I'm going to feel that way for every single animal that does enter a shelter. And we are doing better than we've ever done nationally. I believe the national save rate is now 79%. So it's now a smaller percentage of animals who are being euthanized unnecessarily, which still too many, but we have to also recognize the amazing progress that we've been making.
Okay. And Gaytan?
One anecdote I would like to share is I went to a shelter to visit to do a filming, and past the reception there was a door with a code, a keypad, and it was a sign saying "No visitor allow, restricted area, staff only." And my reaction was, okay, the shelter part is not visible, and it's what's going on between the door or behind that door, nobody knows. And my words will be more transparency for the shelter to the user or the public. And if there's more transparency, there will be better understanding of what's going on, better understanding of the needs, and better understanding
Yes.
of what is happening there. So that's my take on our conversation today.
Transparency.
Or
Yes.
understanding of why why the door is closed and that. Yeah, I agree with that. I
There is
agree.
another reason for that, and that's safety.
Yeah, oh
Yes.
right, exactly.
Okay.
But yeah,
Yeah, but
for your sake, this, right,
right. I understand the part of safety, and if you can have the closed door and this and that, but the transparency can be maybe facilitate with a monitor camera or something where you can, have an open uh, conversation with your own client. Say, okay, we have dogs in the shelter here. We have nothing to hide. Look, they are this is how they feel, how they live, and how it's set up. And that's what I'm suggesting. It's a better, you know, transparency in that regard. I understand the point of safety, be safe all the time, but the other part is transparency between the shelter and the client and the people using the shelter. And people want to know what's going on with the shelter so they can help better,
right,
better
yeah.
sense to help.
Right. I did.
So
I had a question for Doctor Pizano with COVID. Okay, a lot of things changed. A lot of shelters got cleared out too. They were fostering, they were home, and there was some other stuff. But now we're overwhelmed. the rescues are, the shelters
Yeah.
are, and is did we learn? Are we going to learn anything from COVID?
Oh, absolutely. And if you want to put in the chat, pethealth.com, Kathy. So, Pet
Okay.
Health has tracked 1,300 shelters that use Pet Pointer Chameleon. And so they have some great data. And we were also excited to see the numbers drop during COVID and have in 2020 and have lower shelter intake and more people fostering. Now, what's happening is the numbers are approaching the 2019 numbers, but guess what? There's not more owner surrenders. There's not returns of animals who were adopted during COVID. What we're seeing, like I said, is those increases in length of stay. So it's really important to understand what's happening nationally, to look at these trends. I do think it's the length of stay that's hurting, especially those transport lines, that there's a lot of shelters in the South that are suffering because they don't have their destination shelter tracks that they've normally had pre-COVID. But let me tell you, a lot of shelters pivoted, did so much great virtual work, virtual adoptions, which I never thought was going to be a positive thing, has been amazing. The communities have stepped up. There's been, I think, an amplification of education about shelters during COVID, and Greater Good did a hashtag stay home and foster. 80,000 people came forward immediately to foster shelter pets. And guess what? Most of them, they either adopted them or got them home. So we saw so many shelters step out, implement best practices that we've been recommending, just because it was an emergency situation and they're never going to go back to their old ways. So a lot of good things came out of the pandemic for shelters.
Oh, that's great. And
I
I
want to
loved it.
add
That's
something
awesome.
here.
Okay.
I want to add something here because my belief, seeing the in between part. I work with people who, having dogs with separation anxiety, dogs with aggression, dogs who adopted during COVID and fostered for rescues during COVID, and now they're afraid to return the dog because they know the dog is going to go back, is going to be killed or something like that. So let's call it, people shopped for Christmas or like these early sales, and all of a sudden they will not shop next time. So
Right.
right now, I think it looks good, but we're not over the hill yet. It's going to hit the
Yeah.
fan soon. And so my suggestion is we have to be aware, and we still continue educating. Just because the numbers look low doesn't mean they are low. Separation anxiety is at the maximum right now. Now that the
Yeah.
veterinarians start prescribing medication, how long will that work out?
And the eviction
Trainers,
crisis. I mean, that's
right?
Yeah.
it's very scary. Yes.
And then we have trainers that are over capacity. Right now, I have
Yeah.
like 4, 5 to 6 sessions a day, 5 days a week. I will not be able to do more than that because I'm
And sessions
burned
aren't
out.
10 minutes.
And they're online sessions, meaning is
Yeah.
I don't have travel expenses. I don't have travel to do. So I can do like every hour a session, basically, right? Um, and that don't have enough. I don't have enough time, and we're
Yeah.
not enough people who understand that concept and can help support it remotely. So I know people who are waiting to get on a line on a behaviorist for the next 15 months. It's an
Yeah.
emergency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Right.
these
Yeah.
dogs will suddenly be kept
And
away.
I'm in a similar situation with the rescue. I don't do it. Roman and I do something a little bit differently. I only work with the rescue dogs. Okay, with the adopters, the fosters, in the rescue, or owner surrenders. My job is to keep the dog in their homes. Okay,
It's
so I'm
most
a little
important.
different, and I'm not enough hours in a day sometimes.
Right. Well, I think the next show we should probably do should be on the veterinarian crisis, because that seems to be a real issue too now, right, Sarah? Dr.
That I don't
Lemon,
have
sorry.
any answers for, so I'm not
Okay.
going to be on that show.
Okay. All right.
No, I actually do have. We have some exciting things we're working on.
Okay.
So I have
Okay.
hope, a little bit of hope for that.
The
All right.
rescue I'm with actually has, and most rescues, compliant rescues, are like this. But National or Great Pyrenees Rescue of Missouri has a veterinarian on staff,
Yeah.
as a volunteer vet. He's not a volunteer; he does this for a living. But so rescues have some place to go.
Right.
Okay? So,
Okay, everybody. This is a wrap. Our show has been
thanks.
been an hour. Thanks so much
Thank
for being
you.
on. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.